Bulavanaka. My name's Stuart Kninmonth. I'm a senior lecturer at USP, and I'm helping out Dr. Amanda Ford with the Marine Spatial Planning lectures. So today I want to talk a bit about integrated coastal zone management. There was in the early days, a lot of push-down approach, trying to tell people what to do. You need to do this, you need to do that. And it didn't really work. And part of the problem was they didn't really think about the fact that it's not about the coastal problems, about fishing, about erosion, about development. It's not about those, it's about the people problem. And they need to talk about how to think about the people, in particularly how to make the people look after the coastal zone in a sustainable way. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about integrated coastal management, but also I'm going to particularly focus on the Great Barrier Reef. So here I am sitting here. This is the shore of the Heron Island in the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia. And you can see the reef behind me here extending right out. This is a bit of a coastal zone here. We've got a beach, some trees and things behind me, and there's a small resort, and there's also the research station which I manage. So let's have a think about the integrated coastal management. Now, first of all, we start off, we've got people, and we've got the coastal zone. And this concept map that I'm drawing is going to be a good way to think about this very issue. How do I get these people to look after the coastal zone? How can we make this work? Well, the first thing is these people come in a variety of social forms. First of all, we have individuals and communities, and we have nations. And so, well, let's just put that in. Individuals, communities, and nations. And you can see here that people aren't just people, they're not general, they come in a variety of forms. And each of those groups are going to interact with this coastal zone. We've got individuals, we've got communities, and we have nations. And in some countries it's different a little bit in terms of how these work out. In some countries the nation is very strong, particularly some of the very strong communist countries. They have a very strong national perspective on what to do, and that's normally at the expense of the individuals. In some countries, particularly like in the Pacific, the individuals and the communities are very closely tied. In fact, in some parts of the Pacific, the community is the very strong part of what makes up the peoples and how they interact. So we're going to have a look at those three areas and explore kind of how they make decisions. The first thing that we need to be aware of is that the people are trying to meet their needs. All right. The whole time they're trying to meet their needs, whereas in the coastal zone it's more about sustainability. So let's just take a look at individuals. Well, the first thing that controls an individual's decision is going to be rules. And then next to that will be customs. And you can see here that the rules very much control what an individual does, a bit like a road rules does. It stops you from, say, doing speeding when you should be going at a certain speed rate, where you know if you break the rule you're going to get in trouble. So the rules are literally imposed, but they're there to be sort of acknowledged. And then you have customs. So customs are like what you should do to follow the rules of your society. However, these are not really enough. For the communities, they have a number of other ones. So the communities, they have things like knowledge, and technology, and they also have science. So in this case, the communities, they interact with knowledge and technology, and they also interact with customs. And they also look at science. And even though communities can be very traditional, the use of knowledge and technology is paramount these days. And the reason being is quite simple. Technology has a double-edged sword. Some things are good, some things are bad. And the part of technology that's very useful to know is that with technology, communities are able to utilize vast amounts of information, but also things like new fishing gear and fast outboards and very good boats for zooming around on the reef, scuba gear, those sorts of things. So the communities relate very much to these three aspects. For the nations, however, it's not that simple. They're in a very different way. And they relate to things like laws and also to treaties. So a nation itself never really interacts with a coastal zone, because a nation is just an artificial construct in our heads. You know, it's something that we kind of make up. You don't actually ever see the nation. You know, even if you're sailing around the world, you might land on an island in, say, the Lao group, but you wouldn't actually know it's from Fiji unless you've looked at your map and the map tells you. There's nothing actually there to tell you it's from Fiji or something like that. So nations are a little bit of an abstract concept, but in so doing they have to look at what treaties they're going to look at, and they also tend to develop laws. The treaties tends to go and to make institutions, and these institutions are given basically the role to grab a treaty and then to turn it into law. These institutions never really have to deal with the coast directly. They very rarely are the ones that are actually out there fishing and doing those sorts of things. They rely on the community and the laws to help them manage the coastal environment. And so we can see here that these laws translate to here, but the laws themselves aren't isolated. They actually relate very much to the communities, and they also relate to the individuals. And the individuals turn those into rules, and the rules follow to here. This sort of broad network is then going to lead to the coastal zone management. So then you've got science, which goes to coastal management, you know, the science of engineering, the science of knowing what to do, those sorts of things. You have knowledge going through what to do about the land, about the rivers and the fishing, how much to do of what. You have customs as well that tell you what are things that you should be doing that are appropriate. And then finally, the rules as well tell you what you're not allowed to do and what you can do. The problem is, in the days gone by, this was seen as sort of the model where everything would work, but it didn't. The reason being is that people just ignored the rules, a bit like they do with traffic laws, where people, if there's no police around, people will drive faster than they should. And likewise with customs, all of us wants to do the right thing and obey the knowledge of generations, but sometimes this can be lost in the translation to meeting the needs. So one of the critical things here is empowerment. And empowerment's quite simple. It just means giving power to the people. And that's what it's about. How can you allow this group of tools, of decision-making tools, to become more powerful? And the empowerment is about feeding it back to the people such that the people want to follow rules, the people want to follow customs, the people see knowledge and technology as being beneficial, and they see science as being beneficial. So some of the things that you can do for empowerment is you can do monitoring. And you can monitor the environment. And this is very empowering if you can get a community to monitor the environment, because that can then feed back to things like the rules. If the monitoring tells you that the fishing is not going too good, maybe you need to increase the rules to make it, say, smaller, or change the rules. Maybe you need to do something. You need to experiment, and this course will touch on things like adaptive management. Another thing that you can do is education. I'm just going to put it in short. So you can educate as well. And education is very powerful, because education then gives people the chance to review what their customs are, and also to understand how they can use knowledge and technology. Through education, we're able to have a sense of control, a sense of empowerment about how this can work together. And when the customs and the knowledge and the technology are really working, then the people will tend to manage the coastal zone much better. One last one here is transparency, and I'm just going to turn this on its side to right. Transparency. And transparency is very important. Empowerment needs transparency. If it's all hidden behind professors or government officials or chiefs and other people, then it's not going to work. So empowerment needs transparency to work, and transparency is going to feed into essentially a whole range of ones, particularly into rules. Why does a rule exist? Why does it work? This is the science behind it. This is why we've done this rule. And if it's not working, then it needs to be transparently changed. Same with customs, same with knowledge, and very much same with science as well. Science needs to be transparent. How has it been done? How has it been connected? All those things are really important. So, this is a bit of a general framework of how it might sort of flow through. And you can see that, as I finished here, that just simply the people who are meeting their needs are going through a number of channels to go through a number of decision-making processes. And in doing so, they have to be empowered to make this all work, because this cycle here needs to be very active. And you can see I've got lots of loops here, that it goes from being rules to empowerment to, say, education, back to rules, back to empowerment, and then finally to the management of the coastal zone. So let's have a look at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and how they've done what they've done. So here in Australia, in the Great Barrier Reef, the issues are very similar to the Pacific. How to assist and help people manage the resources well without making a big mistake. And the big mistake is letting people just do whatever they want. Because if you damage the resources too much, then they're not sustainable. They'll collapse. And the cost of restoration, the cost of getting back to something that's healthy will just be too high. And so that's the mistake. So one of the things that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park did was to do a zoning. And this is one of the zoning plans. So the Great Barrier Reef is very, very large. It has about 3,000 odd reefs, 3,200 reefs. And over those reefs, every single reef was basically taken into a number of different zones, which I'll talk about in just a minute. To do that process, though, was an enormous exercise over many years, almost 10 years, where they gave an empowerment to the people. And the empowerment was they let people draw on maps and receive submissions and had discussions and community groups. And the federal government, which controls all of Australia, was able to work with the Queensland government, which just controls the small area around the Barrier Reef. They were able to work together to try to figure out how the community can help develop a plan for the entire Great Barrier Reef. And this is actually a very, very big exercise because lots of people have got different views. There are some people who just want to do whatever they like. But that doesn't work too good, and there's a lot of scientists who showed that doing whatever you like isn't really a great solution. It ends up basically you don't have very much for everyone else, and that the system will collapse very quickly. So another group of scientists were basically saying, hey, listen, we need to get together, we need to zone up the scheme in a number of different ways. We need to have areas, and they're shown here by colours. You need to have areas like this blue zones, which you can go fishing. The yellow zones you can go privately fishing, so it's not for selling fish. You can have green zones and orange zones, which are for research and for preservation. And then there's a couple of other smaller zones for ports and things. And so you can see the map essentially is built in sort of 2 or 3 zones that you can quickly see. There's the blue zone, which allows you to do things like trawling and commercial fishing. The green zones, which allow you to go to the zones and have a look, but you're not allowed to take. So they're often called no-take zones. And these green zones are the preservation zone. Then there's the yellow zones where you're allowed to take some fish, but not for sale. It's just simply for personal use, for family use. And these zones enable the barrier reef to have rules. So these rules allow you, and they tell you what you can do here. Not very easy to see, but they tell you whether you can go do aquaculture, netting, boating and diving, crabbing, harvesting, whether you want to do collecting of things, whether you want to go spearfishing, line fishing, shipping, tourism, and traditional use of marine resources, trawling and trolling. And it tells you what the rules are. And part of that rules was that they also made sure they were going to enforce it very strongly. So it doesn't really work though if it's just a whole set of rules. People needed to be brought on board. People needed to believe that this was going to be a good way forward. It was going to benefit everyone. And so the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority worked closely with the Queensland National Park Service to help together to manage the entire system. And as you can see, it's very, very large. This is just one small part. Heron Island that I'm sitting on here is just tucked in this very tiny little bit down here. It's a green zone, so the area behind me is a no-take zone, but there are some areas which can be fished off to the side. And there's also One Tree Island, which is a scientific zone, and you're not allowed to go there unless you're a scientist who is working on a particular project. So these zones are all made up to help manage this entire area. And you can see here that some of the areas are very big, some are quite small, and that all really fits together with how the usage is. And this is the main tool that they've used. They also use some catch limits, some seasonal closures. There's the seasonal closure, what's called the finfish seasonal closure. So it's where they stop you from fishing certain species on the reefs in certain times of the year, mainly to help them make sure that the young fish are not, the adults who are having aggregations for breeding purposes are not being interfered with too much. But altogether, the critical thing here was the empowerment, and they've got a strong monitoring program that costs a lot of money. They have a strong education program. These maps, for instance, that I'm holding here are free, and the map contains a whole lot of information about turtles and fishing gear and why they've gone this and why they've done that. And so the education process is strong, and it doesn't stop here. There's a continual education program happening. The other one is transparency. They made all this publicly available. You can download all the data, you can see all the decisions. There's lots and lots of reports written, and people are able to absorb how this has all been put together. And so in doing so, these zones has been a very successful program. It doesn't stop climate change and it doesn't stop other things, but in general, it helps manage the marine environment. One of the critical things for the integrated coastal zone management is, though, how does it affect managing the marine environment when you've got this huge land area next to you? And it was a bit of a problem in the early days because some of these rivers which are coming into the barrier reef are enormous. And these very large rivers cross beef production country, sugarcane farming country, and also urban areas. So consequently, some of the water coming off there was quite polluted with nutrients, fertilizers, sediments, and a whole lot of issues. So some of the coastal areas here have suffered greatly as a direct result. In doing so, the Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority realised it couldn't just manage the reef by itself. It has to also be involved in the management of the land-based areas. And so they've been working with the land-based groups, which again are the institutions that help the farmers and go do the right thing. They've been helping those farmers to work together to develop sustainable practices, things like putting buffers on rivers, not using as much fertiliser, ensuring the cattle are controlled away from water sources in order to protect the marine environment. And it's been, on the whole, an ongoing program that will probably take another 10-20 years to show really good, strong effect. But it's much needed, and there's strong evidence that it's working. So that's the integrated coastal zone management here in Australia for the Great Barrier Reef. And as you can see, it's quite complicated, a lot of rules and a lot of knowledge and technology and science. And it also satisfies a lot of laws and treaties. It's an expensive exercise, but in doing so, it's managed to preserve and capture some of the most beautiful parts here of Australia. and some parts of the world. And in doing so, it satisfies a lot of international treaties, and that's an important aspect to note. So, from that, I hope you learned a bit more about why we need to think about people and the coastal zone. And I think, I hope you have some appreciation of the fact that we've got to try to tie together what's happening on the land where the people live, and also what's happening in the marine environment where they're trying to get various facilities from the marine environment, like fish and also coral, etc. But as you can see, beautiful spot, well worth preserving. Vinaka.